The mess hall at Naval Station Westbrook hummed with the mundane rhythm of lunch hour. Silverware clinked against trays. Conversations blended into a familiar chorus. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above tables where sailors and officers ate, talked, and momentarily escaped the rigid structure of military life. No one noticed her at first. She stood 5'4" in standard naval utilities with no rank insignia visible. Her dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, revealed a face that seemed unremarkable, except for a thin, faded scar tracing her right cheekbone. At 42, she moved with quiet efficiency. As she approached the coffee station, her posture relaxed yet perfectly balanced. Something in the way she surveyed the room suggested a lifetime of cataloging exits, assessing threats, and maintaining situational awareness. Catherine Morgan poured coffee into a standard issue mug, her movements economical. Nothing about her demanded attention. Nothing except her absolute stillness when Captain Marcus Fletcher's voice shattered the ambient noise of the mess hall. "You think you stand there like you own the place," Fletcher's voice carried across the room. Conversations died mid-sentence as 60 heads turned toward the confrontation brewing near the coffee station. Fletcher stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of a decorated officer. His uniform was immaculate ribbon bars displaying combat service in Iraq and Afghanistan. At 38, his face carried the weathered look of someone who had seen more than his fair share of combat. When an officer enters a room, proper protocol is to acknowledge their presence. Fletcher continued, stepping closer to Morgan. Or did they stop teaching basic military courtesy wherever you came from? Morgan turned slowly, coffee mug steady in her hand. "Sir, I was simply getting coffee before my next meeting. No disrespect intended." The mess hall had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff paused their work, peering through service windows at the unfolding scene. Sergeant James Rodriguez, a 35-year veteran approaching retirement age, shifted uncomfortably at his table, sensing something about this confrontation that felt dangerously off. "Your next meeting?" Fletcher laughed, the sound harsh in the silence. What meeting could possibly be important enough to ignore proper military protocol? Morgan's expression remained neutral, her voice calm. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately rather than disrupting the mess hall, sir." Fletcher stepped closer, deliberately invading her space. His face flushed with anger, veins prominent on his forehead. Those who knew him recognized the warning signs of his notorious temper. Fletcher had earned a Bronze Star for valor in Fallujah, but his return from his third deployment had brought back a man changed by what he had witnessed. "Don't you dare tell me how to handle military discipline," Fletcher snapped. "Everyone here needs to see what happens when proper authority is challenged." Rodriguez saw it coming before anyone else. The set of Fletcher's shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the way his right hand clenched, then relaxed. A flash of movement followed, as Fletcher's open palm struck Morgan across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound cracked through the mess hall like a gunshot. Morgan absorbed the impact without stepping backward. Her coffee mug remained perfectly steady, not a single drop spilled. She slowly raised her left hand to touch her reddening cheek, her eyes never leaving Fletcher's. When she looked back at him, something had changed in her gaze. The pleasant neutrality was gone, replaced by something that made several veterans in the room instinctively straighten in their seats. It was the look of someone who had faced far worse than an angry captain. Someone who had stared death in the face so many times that this moment registered as barely an inconvenience. "Thank you for the demonstration, Captain," Morgan said quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. "I believe that will be sufficient." As she turned to leave, Rodriguez noticed details he had missed before. The way she balanced her weight perfectly, the calluses visible on her hands that spoke of thousands of hours of weapons training, the almost imperceptible scans she performed as she assessed everyone in the room in seconds. Most telling was her absolute composure after being physically assaulted. This was no ordinary person. Rodriguez had spent enough time around special operators to recognize one when he saw one. 20 years working alongside SEAL teams and Force Recon had taught him the subtle signs. This woman moved like a ghost, like someone trained to enter a room without being remembered to blend into any environment. The kind of operator the military officially denied existed. Fletcher stood watching her leave, chest puffed out, apparently satisfied with having established his dominance. The conversations in the mess hall slowly resumed, but with the uncomfortable tension of witnesses who knew they had seen something inappropriate possibly criminal. Rodriguez finished his meal quickly, then made his way toward the communications center. 35 years of military service had honed his instincts. Something wasn't right about what he had just witnessed, and the gnawing feeling in his gut demanded answers. The communications center hummed with activity as Rodriguez pushed through the door. Petty Officer Hayes glanced up from his monitoring station, noting the serious expression on the veteran sergeant's face. "Hayes, I need you to run a personnel check for me, quietly." Hayes straightened, recognizing the serious tone. "What kind of check, Sergeant?" "Woman in the mess hall about 20 minutes ago. Captain Fletcher had an altercation with her. Dark hair regulation style, about 5'4", no visible rank insignia, probably mid-40s. Thin scar on right cheekbone." Rodriguez described her as precisely as his trained memory allowed. Hayes began typing on his terminal, accessing the base personnel database. "Any unit designation or identifying features?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Rodriguez replied, glancing out the window toward the mess hall. In his experience, when someone took a hit like Morgan had and showed no reaction, it usually meant they had resources and authority the aggressor couldn't imagine. Hayes frowned at his screen. "I'm not finding anyone matching that description in our active duty roster, Sergeant. Could she be visiting from another command?" Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. "Try the distinguished visitor log. Check recent arrivals, especially anyone with security clearances." The typing resumed more urgent now. Hayes understood that tone in the sergeant's voice. It meant potential trouble that could reach far beyond their small communications center. After several minutes of searching, Hayes looked up with an expression that confirmed Rodriguez's growing concerns. "Sergeant, there's a security flag on this search. I can see someone matching that description arrived yesterday, but the file requires admiral-level clearance." Rodriguez closed his eyes momentarily. In 35 years of service, he had learned that security flags usually meant one of two things. The person was either extraordinarily important or dangerously specialized. Sometimes both. "Can you tell who authorized the visit?" Hayes scrolled carefully. "The authorization traces back to Pentagon level, but that's all I can access." He paused, then added quietly, "Sergeant, should I log this inquiry?" Rodriguez considered the question. Logging the search would create a record that might protect them later, but would also alert higher-ups that someone was asking questions about their mysterious visitor. "Log it," Rodriguez decided. "Note that we were responding to a potential security concern involving unauthorized physical contact with the restricted visitor." As Hayes logged the entry, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison entered the communications center, her expression unusually tense. "Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Patterson needs to see you immediately." The formality in her tone told Rodriguez this wasn't a casual conversation. He followed Morrison out, wondering how Patterson already knew about the incident. It had happened less than 45 minutes ago, and he was certain no one had filed an official report yet. Colonel William Patterson's office occupied the eastern corner of the administration building, providing views of both the harbor and the main parade ground. When Rodriguez entered, Patterson was staring at his computer screen, his face ashen. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Patterson acknowledged without looking up. "I understand there was an incident in the mess hall involving Captain Fletcher and a woman without visible rank insignia." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez confirmed, standing at attention. "Captain Fletcher confronted her about proper protocol, and the situation escalated until he struck her across the face." Patterson finally looked up, his expression grim. "And what happened after that?" "She remained composed, sir, extraordinarily composed. She made a brief comment and then left the mess hall." Patterson turned his monitor so Rodriguez could see the screen. A classified file was open showing a photograph that matched the woman from the mess hall. The information beside the image made Rodriguez's blood run cold. Major Catherine Morgan, United States Navy, formerly attached to SEAL Team 6, Distinguished Service Cross Navy, Cross Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart with 3 clusters. Current assignment, Pentagon Deputy Director of Special Operations Assessment Division. But what truly shocked Rodriguez was the additional notation, Ghost Protocol Graduate Class 001, status active. Rodriguez had heard whispers about Ghost Protocol during his decades of service, a program so classified that most military personnel believed it was just a rumor. Supposedly established after the Gulf War, it created operators who could move through the most sensitive environments undetected, gathering intelligence and executing missions that officially never happened. "She's here conducting an unannounced inspection of our special operations training facilities," Patterson said quietly. As part of a Pentagon-wide assessment of security protocols following last month's intelligence leak. Patterson turned back to his computer and pulled up the security footage from the mess hall. From multiple angles, they watched the confrontation unfold again. The crystal-clear footage showed Fletcher's hand making contact with Morgan's face. "I've just received a call from Admiral Jackson's office." Patterson continued, his voice tight. "Apparently a team of 3 generals will be arriving within 3 hours to conduct an immediate investigation." Rodriguez processed this information, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Does Captain Fletcher know who he assaulted, sir?" "Not yet," Patterson replied, reaching for his secure phone. "But he's about to find out. I need you to secure all witnesses from the mess hall. No one leaves the base until they've been debriefed by the investigating team." And as Rodriguez turned to leave, Patterson added, "And Sergeant, this stays absolutely quiet for now. The last thing we need is panic spreading through the ranks before the investigation team arrives." Captain Marcus Fletcher sat in his quarters, meticulously typing his report about the mess hall incident. His fingers moved confidently across the keyboard as he detailed what he viewed as necessary disciplinary action against an insubordinate service member. In 17 years of service, Fletcher had developed firm beliefs about maintaining proper military order and discipline. His office walls displayed shadow boxes containing medals and photographs from 3 combat deployments. A particularly prominent frame held his Bronze Star citation from the Battle of Fallujah, where he had led his platoon through 3 days of house-to-house fighting to rescue a surrounded Marine unit. Fletcher paused his typing, recalling the mess hall confrontation. The woman's composure had irritated him even more than her initial failure to acknowledge his rank. Something about her calm demeanor had triggered a memory he worked hard to suppress. The village outside Kandahar, 2008. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Sarah Winters had insisted the route was clear based on her analysis. Fletcher had argued for an alternate approach, but Winters' assessment had prevailed. 20 minutes later, his Humvee rolled over an IED. 2 men died instantly. Another lost both legs. Fletcher unconsciously rubbed the scar that ran along his right forearm, a permanent reminder of that day. Since then, he had developed a deep distrust of female personnel in combat-adjacent roles. In his mind, they endangered real warriors with theoretical knowledge that didn't account for battlefield realities. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Captain Fletcher, Colonel Patterson requests your presence in his office immediately." 15 minutes later, Fletcher stood at attention in Patterson's office, his uniform immaculate and his bearing confident. He fully expected the colonel to support his actions in maintaining good order and discipline. "Captain Fletcher, please describe exactly what occurred in the mess hall this afternoon." Patterson requested, his voice carefully neutral. Fletcher began his account with obvious self-assurance. "Sir, I observed a service member displaying improper military courtesy. When verbal correction proved insufficient, I deemed it necessary to provide immediate physical discipline to reinforce proper standards of conduct." Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. As Fletcher continued his self-incriminating account, the colonel found himself amazed at the captain's complete unawareness of the magnitude of his error. "Captain, did you make any attempt to verify this person's identity before taking physical action?" Fletcher appeared confused by the question. "Sir, she was clearly junior personnel, no visible rank insignia, and her failure to show proper respect confirmed her status." At that moment, Captain Williams knocked and entered with an expression of barely controlled urgency. "Sir, we have 3 helicopters approaching from the northeast. Pentagon markings, ETA 15 minutes. Patterson dismissed Williams and turned back to Fletcher, who was beginning to show the first signs of uncertainty. "Captain, I need you to understand something very important." The colonel leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. "The woman you struck in the mess hall was not junior personnel. She was Major Catherine Morgan, Deputy Director of Special Operations Assessment at the Pentagon." The color drained from Fletcher's face. "She's the daughter of Admiral Thomas Jackson, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and she was here conducting an official Pentagon assessment when you assaulted her." Fletcher's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his mind struggling to process the implications. "Sir, that's impossible," he finally managed. "She had no rank insignia. She didn't identify herself." Patterson stood and walked to his window, where the approaching helicopters were now visible on the horizon. "Captain, ignorance is not a defense for assaulting a superior officer. The fact that you failed to verify her identity before taking physical action only compounds your offense. The first helicopter touched down on the base landing pad with military precision. Three figures in dress uniforms emerged their bearing, making it clear these were very senior officers. Now, Captain Patterson continued, "You will return to your quarters under house arrest until the investigating team is ready to interview you. You are not to discuss this incident with anyone except the investigating officers and your assigned legal counsel." Fletcher had sunk into a chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Sir, what happens now?" Patterson turned from the window to face his subordinate. "This is no longer a matter of military discipline, Captain. This is a federal assault case involving a senior officer during an official Pentagon inspection." The second helicopter disgorged a team of military police investigators, equipment cases in hand. The third carried what appeared to be a legal team, their briefcases suggesting formal charges were already being prepared. Base personnel had gathered at a respectful distance to watch the unprecedented arrival of such high-ranking attention. Word was spreading quickly that something extraordinary had occurred, though most still didn't understand the full scope of the situation. Captain Williams arrived to escort Fletcher to his quarters, where he would wait under guard until the investigating team began formal proceedings. As they left the colonel's office, Fletcher looked back with the expression of a man who finally understood that his military career was over. Lieutenant General Robert Harrison strode into the base conference room with the bearing of a man who had handled the military's most sensitive investigations for over 2 decades. Major General Anthony Roberts and Brigadier General Maria Martinez followed their combined presence, representing more star power than Naval Station Westbrook had seen in its entire operational history. Colonel Patterson stood at attention as the three generals entered, their aides immediately beginning to establish a command center for what would clearly be an extensive investigation. Colonel Patterson, Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I want you to understand that this investigation has the personal attention of the Secretary of Defense and the President. When a senior officer is assaulted while conducting official duties, it becomes a matter of national security as well as military justice." The generals had reviewed the security footage during their flight to the base. The crystal-clear images of Captain Fletcher striking Major Morgan left no room for interpretation or defense. What they needed now was to understand how such a catastrophic failure of command and control had occurred. Major General Roberts opened his briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "Colonel, we've already spoken with Pentagon security about Major Morgan's visit to your base. She was here conducting an unannounced inspection of your special operations training facilities as part of her duties." Patterson felt his stomach drop. An unannounced inspection meant that Major Morgan had been evaluating his base's performance and readiness when she was assaulted by one of his officers. The implications for his own career were becoming clear. Brigadier General Martinez consulted her tablet. "Colonel, according to our records, Captain Fletcher has had 3 previous incidents involving excessive use of authority with subordinate personnel. Why was he still in a command position?" The question struck at the heart of Patterson's command failures. He had been aware of Fletcher's aggressive tendencies, but had chosen to counsel rather than discipline him, believing the captain's combat experience outweighed his personality issues. Sir, Captain Fletcher received counseling for those incidents, but they were deemed not severe enough to warrant formal disciplinary action. Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the base. "Colonel, counseling clearly was insufficient. Your failure to take stronger action enabled today's assault on a senior officer. This represents a fundamental breakdown in command responsibility." Within 2 hours of their arrival, the investigation team had interviewed 15 witnesses, reviewed all security footage, and begun constructing a timeline that would support formal charges against Captain Fletcher and potentially Colonel Patterson himself. Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first witnesses called for formal testimony. As he recounted the incident under oath, the generals took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about the base's command climate and the frequency of such confrontations. "Did Captain Fletcher regularly use physical intimidation with personnel he perceived as subordinate?" Major General Roberts asked. Rodriguez chose his words carefully. "Sir, the captain had a reputation for being harsh with discipline. Most personnel tried to avoid situations where they might draw his attention." The generals exchanged meaningful looks. A pattern of aggressive behavior culminating in assaulting a senior officer suggested systemic problems beyond one captain's poor judgment. Meanwhile, Major Morgan herself had returned to the base at the request of the investigating team. She entered the conference room with the same composed demeanor she had shown in the mess hall, her presence immediately commanding attention. Now dressed in her full uniform, with rank clearly visible, the transformation was remarkable. The unassuming woman from the coffee station was gone, replaced by an officer whose bearing and decorations told a story of extraordinary service. Major Morgan and Lieutenant General Harrison said, "We need your official statement for the record." Morgan's account was precise and professional and delivered without emotion or editorializing. She described Captain Fletcher's escalating aggression, his failure to verify her identity, and the deliberate nature of the physical assault. Her testimony was devastating in its calm objectivity. When asked why she hadn't immediately identified herself to prevent the escalation, her response revealed the deeper purpose of her visit. "I was conducting an assessment of command climate and personnel interactions. Identifying myself would have invalidated the inspection and prevented me from observing actual conditions." The revelation that the assault had occurred during an official Pentagon inspection elevated the incident from a serious disciplinary matter to a potential court-martial offense, with implications for the entire base's operational status. As afternoon progressed into evening, Naval Station Westbrook was under complete lockdown. Military police had positioned themselves at every gate, and no personnel were permitted to leave without explicit authorization from the investigating team. The entire facility had effectively become a crime scene under federal jurisdiction. Lieutenant General Harrison issued orders that reverberated through every department on the base. All training exercises were suspended immediately. All leave and liberty were canceled indefinitely. Every member of Fletcher's unit was restricted to quarters pending individual interviews. The base communications center had been taken over by Pentagon security specialists monitoring all outgoing communications. Petty Officer Hayes watched nervously as federal investigators reviewed every message from the past 72 hours, looking for any indication that personnel might have been aware of Major Morgan's true identity. In the base legal office, Commander Susan Torres, the staff judge advocate, briefed the investigating generals on potential charges against Captain Fletcher. The list was extensive and carried severe penalties under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. "Assault on a superior commissioned officer under Article 90, she began. "This carries a maximum penalty of 5 years confinement and dismissal from service. Conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133 adds additional penalties." She paused before continuing. "If we include federal assault charges for striking a senior officer during official duties, Captain Fletcher could face civilian prosecution as well." Major General Roberts nodded. "Commander Torres, we also need to consider charges against Colonel Patterson for failure to maintain proper command climate and negligent supervision of subordinate officers." The legal implications were staggering. An entire base command structure was under investigation, and multiple court-martials were becoming increasingly likely with each witness interview. In his quarters, Captain Fletcher sat under guard, comprehending the magnitude of his actions. He had requested permission to call his wife, but that request was denied pending completion of the initial investigation. His military counsel, Commander Frank Davidson, had arrived from the regional legal office and was reviewing the preliminary charges. "Captain Davidson said quietly, I need you to understand that this is the most serious case I've handled in 20 years of military law. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the political implications are extraordinary." Fletcher stared at the wall, his career flashing before his eyes. "How was I supposed to know who she was? She looked like any other service member. She didn't identify herself." Davidson shook his head. "Captain, that's not a legal defense. You assaulted someone without verifying their identity or authority. Under military law, that's inexcusable, regardless of who the victim turned out to be." The investigation team was discovering additional problems beyond the immediate assault. Base records revealed multiple instances where Captain Fletcher's aggressive behavior had been reported but not properly documented or addressed through formal channels. This pattern suggested a systemic failure to address problematic behavior before it escalated to criminal assault. Lieutenant General Harrison called Colonel Patterson for his second formal interview of the day. "Colonel, our investigation has revealed that you received multiple warnings about Captain Fletcher's conduct. Why did you fail to take formal disciplinary action?" Patterson's response revealed the flawed thinking that had enabled the crisis. Sir Captain Fletcher was an effective combat leader with 3 deployments and commendations for valor. I believed his garrison behavior issues could be corrected through counseling and leadership development. The general's expression made clear this explanation was insufficient. Colonel, your job is to maintain good order and discipline. Your failure to address known problems with Captain Fletcher directly enabled today's assault on a senior officer. As evening approached, word was spreading that the investigation team had requested additional personnel from Pentagon security and that the lockdown could continue for days, while every aspect of the base's command climate was examined under federal scrutiny. Admiral Thomas Jackson stood in his Pentagon office reviewing the preliminary investigation report that had arrived via secure transmission 20 minutes earlier. The photographs from the security footage were spread across his desk, each image showing a different angle of his daughter being struck by Captain Fletcher. His aide, Captain Morrison, entered with additional classified updates from Westbrook. Sir Lieutenant General Harrison reports that the investigation has uncovered systemic command failures beyond the immediate assault. He recommends expanding the inquiry to include the entire base leadership structure. Jackson's expression remained professionally controlled, but those who knew him well could see the barely contained fury behind his calm exterior. His daughter had been conducting an official Pentagon inspection when she was assaulted by an officer whose aggressive behavior had been repeatedly ignored by his superiors. "Get me Secretary Davis on Secure Line 1, Jackson instructed. This has escalated beyond a military discipline issue. When a senior officer conducting official duties is assaulted, it becomes a matter requiring the highest levels of attention." Within minutes, Secretary of Defense Davis was on the line. The conversation was brief and decisive. The Secretary agreed that Naval Station Westbrook would be placed under emergency federal oversight until the investigation was complete and all responsible parties held accountable. As night fell over Westbrook, the base resembled an armed camp more than a naval station. Floodlights illuminated the parade ground where military police conducted shift changes. Communication channels buzzed with encrypted traffic as Pentagon officials coordinated the expanded investigation. Personnel whispered in barracks and offices, trying to piece together what had happened and what it meant for their careers and the future of their command. In the officers' quarters, lights burned late as senior staff realized the full implications of what had occurred. A visiting Pentagon official had been physically assaulted while conducting an inspection. The repercussions would be severe, far-reaching, and career-ending for multiple officers in the chain of command. And somewhere in the darkness, Major Catherine Morgan stood at a window overlooking the harbor, her hand occasionally touching the faint scar on her cheek. As the daughter of an admiral and one of the most highly trained operatives in military history, she had faced far worse than an angry captain. But this incident would trigger changes that would reshape military culture and accountability for years to come. The stage was set for a reckoning that would echo through every corner of the United States military. Dawn broke over Naval Station Westbrook with the tension of an active crime scene. The normal morning rhythm had been replaced by the methodical precision of a high-level investigation. Military police checkpoints dotted the perimeter. Security badges were scrutinized with unprecedented care, and the usual chatter of a busy naval base had given way to hushed conversations and nervous glances. The 3 helicopters that had arrived the previous afternoon remained on the landing pad, their presence a visible reminder of the gravity of the situation. A mobile command center had been established in the administration building, transforming the conference room into an operations hub with secure communications equipment, multiple computer terminals, and walls now covered with timeline charts and personnel photographs. Lieutenant General Harrison began the morning briefing at precisely 0700 hours, addressing a room filled with investigators and legal personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be absolutely clear about our mandate here. This is no longer just about a single assault. What happened to Major Morgan appears to be symptomatic of broader command failures that potentially compromise operational readiness across this installation." The general's voice carried the weight of 35 years of military service, including combat command in Desert Storm. His weathered face and calculating eyes reflected a man who had seen both the best and worst of military leadership throughout his career. "The Secretary of Defense has authorized us to expand our investigation to include all aspects of command climate disciplinary procedures and reporting protocols at Naval Station Westbrook. No stone remains unturned. No officer is beyond scrutiny." Major General Roberts stepped forward with a tablet displaying the day's operational plan. We'll be conducting simultaneous interviews across all departments. Military police are securing all personnel files and electronic communications for the past 12 months. Judge Advocate General representatives will be present for all formal testimonies. Brigadier General Martinez, whose legal expertise had built her reputation as one of the sharpest military prosecutors in the service, addressed the investigative protocols. Remember that we are building both a military and potentially federal civilian case here. Every interview must be properly documented, every piece of evidence meticulously preserved. As the meeting concluded, the team dispersed to their assigned tasks with the efficiency that came from handling high-profile military investigations. Meanwhile, across the base, the personnel of Naval Station Westbrook attempted to continue their duties under the shadow of unprecedented scrutiny. In a secure room adjacent to the command center, Major Catherine Morgan reviewed the preliminary reports that had been compiled overnight. Now dressed in her full-service uniform, with rank clearly visible, she cut a strikingly different figure from the unassuming woman who had stood at the coffee station the previous day. Her service ribbons told a story few could believe. The Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat operations against an opposing armed force. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. 3 Purple Hearts, each representing wounds sustained in action. These were just the visible acknowledgments of a career that included numerous classified operations that would never appear in any public record. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. "Enter," she called, her voice calm and controlled. Colonel Patterson stepped into the room, the strain of the past 18 hours visible in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight slump of shoulders that normally maintained perfect military bearing. "Major Morgan," he began, his discomfort evident, "I wanted to personally express my regret for what happened yesterday. Captain Fletcher's actions were inexcusable, and as his commanding officer, I bear ultimate responsibility." Morgan studied Patterson with the analytical precision that had made her one of the most effective intelligence officers in the service. "Colonel, I appreciate your sentiment, but this isn't about an apology. This is about systemic failures in command structure that allowed an officer with known behavioral issues to remain in a position of authority." Patterson nodded, accepting the rebuke. "May I ask why you didn't identify yourself when Fletcher confronted you? It might have prevented the escalation." "That's precisely why I didn't," Morgan replied. "My assignment was to assess actual conditions at this installation, not to observe how people behave when they know they're being watched by a senior Pentagon officer. What I experienced gives us valuable insight into the real command climate here." Before Patterson could respond, his secure phone buzzed. The color drained from his face as he listened to the caller. "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir." He ended the call and looked at Morgan with renewed apprehension. "Admiral Jackson and his delegation have just landed. He's requested your presence at the airfield." Morgan gathered her files with deliberate calmness. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting, Colonel." The morning sun glinted off 3 naval transport helicopters as they settled on the auxiliary landing field. The aircraft had barely powered down when the main door of the lead helicopter swung open, revealing Admiral Thomas Jackson in full dress uniform. At 64, Jackson carried himself with the unmistakable authority that came from commanding thousands of the nation's most elite warriors throughout his storied career. Flanking him as they descended were Admiral Patricia Williams, commander of Naval Forces Atlantique, and Admiral David Thompson, chief of naval operations. Their combined presence represented the highest concentration of naval leadership to ever visit Westbrook at one time. Morgan and Patterson stood at attention as the 3 admirals approached, saluting crisply. Jackson returned the salute with practiced precision, his eyes briefly meeting his daughter's before shifting to Patterson. "Colonel Patterson," Jackson said, his voice carrying decades of command presence, "I trust you understand the gravity of what has occurred at your installation." "Yes, Admiral," Patterson replied. "General Harrison's investigation is proceeding with full cooperation from all base personnel." Jackson nodded curtly. "Let's continue this discussion inside. The Secretary of Defense will be joining us via secure video conference in 30 minutes. As the group moved toward the waiting vehicles, Jackson fell into step beside Morgan, allowing a slight distance to form between them and the others. "Are you all right, Kate?" he asked, his voice lowered, the concern of a father briefly eclipsing the demeanor of an admiral. "I'm fine, sir," Morgan replied, maintaining professional composure. "It's hardly the worst I've experienced in the field." Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly. "That doesn't make it acceptable." Not here, not on American soil, not on a naval installation where chain of command should be sacred. Morgan glanced at her father, noting the tightly controlled anger beneath his professional exterior. This isn't about me, sir. It's about identifying and correcting serious command failures that could compromise operational readiness. It's about both, Jackson replied as they reached the vehicle, and neither will be overlooked. The secured conference room in the administration building had been transformed into a hub of activity. Large monitors displayed classified information, secure communications equipment linked them directly to the Pentagon, and uniformed personnel moved with the urgent efficiency of a military operation in progress. Lieutenant General Harrison briefed the assembled admirals on their preliminary findings. Our investigation has already uncovered multiple incidents involving Captain Fletcher that were handled informally rather than through proper disciplinary channels. We've documented at least 7 cases where female personnel reported aggressive behavior but were discouraged from filing official complaints. Admiral Williams leaned forward, her expression severe. And what was the justification for this pattern of negligence? Patterson shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. Admiral Captain Fletcher has an exemplary combat record. 3 tours in high-intensity conflict zones, a Bronze Star for Valor in Fallujah, and consistently positive performance evaluations from field commanders. So his combat effectiveness was prioritized over his conduct toward fellow service members, Williams stated rather than asked, her disapproval evident. That appears to be the case, ma'am, Harrison confirmed. Admiral Thompson studied the personnel file displayed on his tablet. I see a pattern here that extends beyond Fletcher. Colonel Patterson, your command has shown a consistent tendency to minimize behavioral issues among combat-decorated officers. The question is whether this represents personal bias or institutional failure. Before Patterson could respond, the main screen activated, displaying the seal of the Secretary of Defense. Moments later, Secretary James Davis appeared, his expression grave. Admirals, Generals, I've reviewed the preliminary reports and I'm deeply concerned by what I'm seeing, Davis began. This incident represents not just an assault on a senior officer, but a fundamental breakdown in military discipline and command accountability. The Secretary's gaze seemed to bore through the screen. I want to be absolutely clear, this investigation will be thorough. It will be transparent, and it will result in significant changes to how we handle personnel issues throughout the service. The days of excusing misconduct because of combat decorations are over. As the meeting continued, Captain Marcus Fletcher sat in his quarters under guard, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Commander Davison, his military counsel, reviewed the growing list of potential charges with increasing concern. They're adding Article 153 to the charges, Davidson explained, referring to the UCMJ provision covering conduct unbecoming an officer. And the federal prosecutor is considering charges under Title 18 for assaulting a federal officer during the performance of official duties. Fletcher stared at the wall, his military career flashing before his eyes. All because I disciplined someone I thought was an insubordinate junior sailor. Davidson's expression hardened. Captain, that's precisely the problem. You didn't discipline anyone. You physically struck another person without verifying their identity or having any legitimate authority to do so. That would be wrong regardless of who they turned out to be. Fletcher fell silent, the magnitude of his error finally penetrating his self-justification. How bad is this going to get? Davidson closed his folder. Federal prosecutors are on their way from Washington. You're looking at potential court-martial, followed by federal criminal charges. Best case scenario, dishonorable discharge and loss of all benefits. Worst case, federal prison time. While Fletcher contemplated his future, Sergeant Rodriguez found himself in a small conference room facing Major General Roberts and 2 JAG officers. His testimony from the previous day had impressed the investigation team with its precision and objectivity. Sergeant, based on your extensive experience, I'd like your assessment of the overall command climate here at Westbrook, Roberts requested. Rodriguez chose his words carefully. Sir, in my 35 years of service, I've observed that commands take on the personality of their leaders. Colonel Patterson is a highly decorated combat officer who values operational effectiveness above all else. This has created an environment where technical proficiency and combat readiness are prioritized over interpersonal conduct and administrative discipline. And how has this affected female personnel specifically? Asked one of the JAG officers. Ma'am female service members that are generally respected for their technical abilities, but are often excluded from informal leadership networks. There's an unspoken perception that reporting misconduct is seen as a sign of weakness rather than a necessary function of good order and discipline. Roberts made notes on his tablet. Would you say this environment directly contributed to Captain Fletcher's comfort in publicly confronting and ultimately assaulting Major Morgan? Without question, sir, Rodriguez confirmed. Fletcher operated with the implicit understanding that aggressive behavior toward perceived subordinates would be tolerated, especially if those subordinates were female. As Rodriguez's interview concluded, another drama was unfolding in the base security office. Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Henderson had arrived with a team of federal investigators signaling that the incident had transcended military jurisdiction and entered the realm of federal criminal prosecution. Henderson, a former military prosecutor herself, wasted no time establishing her authority. I'll need access to all security footage, witness statements, and personnel records relevant to this investigation, she informed the base legal officer. This case has the personal attention of the Attorney General. Commander Torres, the staff judge advocate, nodded. We're coordinating with General Harrison's team to ensure all evidence is properly preserved for both military and federal prosecution. Henderson reviewed the security footage on a large monitor, her expression growing more severe as she watched the confrontation from multiple angles. The video evidence is unambiguous, she noted. Combined with witness testimony and the victim's status as a senior officer conducting official Pentagon business, this presents a textbook case for federal prosecution. By midday, news of the federal prosecutor's arrival had spread throughout the base, adding another layer of tension to an already strained atmosphere. In the officers' mess, conversations hushed whenever someone new entered the room, and senior officers found themselves suddenly accountable for casual comments they might have made in the past about female personnel. Meanwhile, in a secure briefing room, Lieutenant General Harrison was receiving a classified presentation that would expand the investigation's scope dramatically. The presenter was a silver-haired man in his 60s whose civilian clothes couldn't disguise his military bearing. He was introduced only as Mr. Wilson, but those with high enough security clearances recognized him as the former commander of the military's most secretive Special Operations Unit. What I'm about to share is classified at the highest levels. Wilson began activating a secure display. 20 years ago, following Operation Desert Storm, Naval Special Warfare identified a critical intelligence gap. Our traditional SEAL teams, while exceptionally effective in combat operations, were sometimes too visible for certain types of intelligence gathering and operational assessment. The display showed a heavily redacted document titled Ghost Protocol, Phase 1 Implementation. We created a specialized training program that went beyond traditional special operations preparation. The goal was to develop operators who could move through any environment undetected, gathering intelligence and conducting assessments without revealing their true capabilities or purpose. Wilson changed the display to show training statistics. The program had a 96% washout rate. Of the initial 50 candidates, only 2 completed the first training cycle. One of those was Catherine Morgan. Harrison studied the documents with growing appreciation. So Major Morgan isn't just a Pentagon staff officer. Major Morgan, Wilson stated with quiet emphasis, is perhaps the most highly trained covert operative ever produced by the United States military. Her operational record includes missions in 27 countries, including several where we officially have no military presence. The implications of this revelation rippled through the room. Captain Fletcher hadn't just assaulted a senior officer. He had struck one of the nation's most valuable intelligence assets during an official assessment mission. Wilson continued, after the Iraq War revealed significant gaps in our intelligence capabilities, Ghost Protocol was expanded. Morgan became the program's chief training officer before moving to her current Pentagon role overseeing Special Operations Readiness Assessment. Harrison nodded slowly, the full picture becoming clearer. In her connection to Admiral Jackson, Wilson's expression remained neutral. She's his daughter, but that relationship has been carefully compartmentalized throughout her career to prevent any appearance of preferential treatment. In fact, she's faced greater scrutiny and higher standards precisely because of that connection. As this briefing concluded, Major Morgan was conducting her own interview with Captain Williams, the base executive officer who had served as Colonel Patterson's second-in-command for the past 3 years. Captain, I'd like to understand the reporting procedures for behavioral incidents involving senior officers. Morgan stated, her tone professional and focused. Walk me through how such reports are typically handled. Williams shifted uncomfortably. Standard procedure requires documentation through the chain of command with copies to the Equal Opportunity Office and the Staff Judge Advocate. And was this procedure followed for the previous incidents involving Captain Fletcher? Not consistently, Williams admitted. Colonel Patterson preferred to handle these matters personally through verbal counseling rather than formal documentation. Morgan made a note in her file. And did you as executive officer ever express concern about this approach? Williams hesitated, understanding the implications of his answer. I raised the issue twice following complaints from female personnel. The colonel felt that formal reprimands might damage Fletcher's career trajectory given his combat record. So the potential impact on Fletcher's career was prioritized over addressing a pattern of misconduct. That's a fair assessment, Williams conceded. Morgan closed her folder. Thank you for your candor, Captain. The investigation team will have additional questions for you this afternoon. As Morgan exited the interview room, she encountered her father in the hallway outside the command center. Admiral Jackson gestured toward a small office that had been cleared for their use. Once inside, with the door closed, he dropped his formal demeanor slightly. This is worse than we initially thought, Jackson stated, running a hand through his silver hair. The command failures here aren't isolated to Fletcher or even Patterson. There's a systemic issue with how misconduct is reported and addressed. Morgan nodded. My assessment, exactly. Fletcher is a symptom, not the disease. Jackson studied his daughter, noting the faint mark still visible on her cheek where Fletcher had struck her. Kate, I've kept our professional and family relationships separate your entire career. I've never pulled strings or shown favoritism. And I've never asked for special treatment, Morgan replied. You know that. I do. Jackson's expression softened momentarily. But I'm finding it difficult to maintain complete objectivity when I watch that security footage. As your commanding officer, I'm proud of how you handled it. As your father, he left the sentence unfinished. Morgan allowed herself a rare moment of personal connection. I've been in far worse situations, Dad. You've read my operational files. Most of them, Jackson acknowledged. Some are classified even beyond my access level. A small smile touched Morgan's lips. Then trust me when I say this hardly registers on my scale of difficult encounters. Their moment of family connection was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lieutenant General Harrison entered with a concerned expression. Admiral, we've just received word from the Pentagon. The media has gotten hold of the story. Initial reports are appearing on national news networks. Jackson's expression hardened, immediately returning to full admiral mode. What details have been released? Only that a senior officer was assaulted during an inspection at Naval Station Westbrook and that a high-level investigation is underway. No names yet, but it's only a matter of time. Implement the media containment protocol, Jackson ordered. All personnel are restricted from speaking to the press. Route all inquiries through Pentagon Public Affairs. As Harrison departed to execute these instructions, Jackson turned back to his daughter. This is about to become very public very quickly. Are you prepared for that? Morgan's expression revealed nothing. I've spent my career avoiding public attention, but if this is what it takes to drive meaningful change in how the military handles these issues, then I'll manage. By mid-afternoon, activity at the base perimeter had increased dramatically as news vans and reporters gathered outside the main gate. Military police reinforcements had arrived from neighboring installations to maintain security and prevent unauthorized access. Inside the command center, Admiral Thompson was on a secure call with the Chief of Naval Operations discussing the broader implications of the investigation. The preliminary findings suggest this isn't isolated to Westbrook, Thompson reported. We're seeing indicators of similar command climate issues at multiple installations where combat veterans hold senior leadership positions. The Secretary of the Navy's voice came through the speaker. This could be our moment to address long-standing cultural issues in the service. I want a comprehensive review of how behavioral misconduct is handled across all naval installations with special attention to gender-based incidents. Thompson acknowledged the order, understanding that what had begun as an investigation into a single assault was rapidly expanding into a service-wide examination of military culture and accountability. In another part of the base, Captain Fletcher was being prepared for transfer to the Military Justice Facility. Commander Davidson had just delivered the news that formal charges had been filed under both the UCMJ and federal criminal statutes. "You'll be transported to the brig at Quantico pending arraignment," Davidson explained. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week." Fletcher sat on his bunk, still struggling to comprehend how quickly his life had unraveled. Who exactly is this Morgan? Why was she here without identifying herself? Davidson hesitated, then decided Fletcher needed to understand the full magnitude of his situation. Major Catherine Morgan is one of the most decorated intelligence operatives in naval history. Most of her service record is classified, but what I can tell you is that she's a graduate of the Ghost Protocol program. Fletcher's head snapped up, his expression changing from confusion to shock. "Ghost is real. I thought that was just a rumor, something people talked about after too many beers." "It's real," Davidson confirmed, "and Major Morgan was not only part of it, she was one of its first graduates and later became its chief training officer. The woman you struck has probably conducted more high-risk covert operations than anyone in the service." Fletcher closed his eyes, the final piece clicking into place. "And she's Admiral Jackson's daughter." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Davidson replied simply, "though that connection has been kept quiet throughout her career to prevent any perception of favoritism." Fletcher laughed bitterly. "So I managed to assault not just any officer, but a highly decorated covert operative conducting an official Pentagon assessment who also happens to be the daughter of one of the most powerful admirals in the Navy." "That about covers it," Davidson confirmed grimly. "What happens now?" Fletcher asked, his voice hollow. "Now you'll be transported to Quantico. I'll continue preparing your defense, though. Given the evidence, our best option may be to negotiate a plea agreement that minimizes your sentence." As Fletcher was being escorted to the transport vehicle under heavy guard, Morgan was completing her official assessment report in the secure office she had been assigned. Despite the assault and the subsequent investigation, she remained focused on her original mission, evaluating the operational readiness and security protocols at Naval Station Westbrook. Her report was detailed and unflinching, identifying critical weaknesses in information security, personnel management, and command accountability. The document would eventually become part of a broader assessment that would reshape training and leadership development throughout the naval service. A knock at her door interrupted her work. "Enter," she called. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, standing at attention. "Major Morgan, I've been asked to escort you to the command center. The investigation team is preparing their preliminary findings briefing." Morgan saved her work and secured her computer. "Thank you, Sergeant. Lead the way." As they walked through the administration building, Rodriguez spoke quietly. "If I may, Major, I want to apologize for not intervening yesterday in the mess hall." Morgan glanced at the veteran NCO. "No apology needed, Sergeant. You had no way of knowing who I was, and your actions afterward demonstrated proper protocol. In fact, your initiative in checking my credentials likely accelerated the response to the incident." Rodriguez nodded, appreciating her understanding. "Still, in 35 years of service, I've never witnessed anything quite like this." "Let's hope it serves as a catalyst for positive change," Morgan replied as they reached the command center door. Inside, the combined investigation team had assembled for what would be a pivotal briefing. Charts, timelines, and personnel photographs covered the walls. Computer screens displayed data analysis and legal precedents. The room fell silent as Morgan entered, all eyes turning toward the woman whose assault had triggered one of the most extensive command investigations in recent naval history. Lieutenant General Harrison took center position at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 24 hours, we've conducted 63 interviews, reviewed thousands of documents, and analyzed 5 years of personnel records. Our preliminary findings indicate systemic failures in leadership accountability and reporting procedures at Naval Station Westbrook." Harrison gestured to a timeline display. The incident involving Major Morgan was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a pattern of misconduct that was consistently minimized, overlooked, or addressed through informal means rather than proper disciplinary channels. Major General Roberts continued the briefing, outlining specific failings in the command structure. Colonel Patterson created an environment where combat experience was prioritized over proper conduct, where reporting misconduct was discouraged, and where female personnel in particular faced an uphill battle in having their concerns addressed. Brigadier General Martinez addressed the legal implications. Based on our findings, we are recommending court-martial proceedings against Captain Fletcher on charges including assault on a superior commissioned officer, conduct unbecoming an officer, and dereliction of duty. She paused before continuing. Additionally, we are recommending that Colonel Patterson face charges of negligent, dereliction of duty, and failure to maintain proper command accountability. The room absorbed this information in silence. The recommended charges would effectively end the careers of both officers, potentially resulting in prison time and loss of benefits. Assistant U.S. Attorney Henderson stepped forward to address the federal aspects of the case. My office will be filing federal charges against Captain Fletcher for assaulting a federal officer in the performance of official duties. Given the evidence including clear video footage and multiple witness statements, we anticipate this will result in a conviction carrying substantial federal prison time. Admiral Jackson, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. This investigation has uncovered issues that extend far beyond Naval Station Westbrook. The problems identified here likely exist at other installations where similar command philosophies have taken root. He stood commanding the attention of everyone present. Therefore, effective immediately, I am authorizing a service-wide review of command climate reporting procedures and accountability mechanisms with special emphasis on how misconduct allegations are handled. Jackson turned to address Morgan directly. Major, your original assessment mission has provided valuable insights that will inform this broader initiative. I'd like you to continue your work, expanding the scope to include additional installations identified as high risk for similar command climate issues. Morgan nodded her acceptance of the assignment, recognizing its importance beyond the immediate case. As the briefing concluded, the sun was setting over Naval Station Westbrook, casting long shadows across the parade ground. The day's events had set in motion changes that would ripple throughout the naval service for years to come. What had begun as a single act of misconduct was transforming into a watershed moment for military accountability and leadership culture. In her temporary quarters that evening, Morgan reviewed the day's developments with the analytical precision that had made her so effective in her covert career. The investigation was proceeding exactly as it should. Accountability was being established, and larger systemic issues were being addressed. Yet as she touched the fading mark on her cheek, she couldn't help reflecting on the irony that after years of dangerous covert operations in hostile territory, it was a confrontation in a naval mess hall that might ultimately have the greatest impact on military culture and the advancement of female personnel in combat-adjacent roles. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. The text was brief but significant. Ghost 7 activated for Phase 2 assessment. Commence at 0600 tomorrow. Morgan acknowledged the order with a single-letter response R for received. The real work was just beginning. Dawn painted Naval Station Westbrook in hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows across a base transformed by 24 hours of high-level investigation. Military police stood at attention at checkpoints throughout the installation, their presence a visible reminder that this was no ordinary day. The morning flag ceremony proceeded with unusual solemnity, the assembled personnel acutely aware they stood at the epicenter of what was rapidly becoming a watershed moment for naval leadership culture. Admiral Thomas Jackson emerged from his temporary quarters precisely at 05:45 hours, his uniform immaculate, his bearing projecting the confidence and authority earned through decades of distinguished service. Two aides flanked him as he made his way toward the administration building, their brisk pace reflecting the gravity of the day ahead. At 0600 hours, 3 additional helicopters appeared on the horizon, their distinctive profiles indicating they carried the highest levels of naval leadership. Inside the secure command center, Lieutenant General Harrison tracked their approach on a monitor, then turned to address the assembled investigation team. Gentlemen, ladies, the Chief of Naval Operations will be landing in approximately 5 minutes, accompanied by the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Their presence underscores the significance of our findings and the broader implications for military culture and leadership. The gravity of the situation hung in the air. Never in recent history had such senior military leadership converged on an installation in response to what had initially appeared to be an isolated disciplinary incident. What had begun as an assault investigation had expanded into a comprehensive examination of command climate and accountability throughout the naval service. Major Catherine Morgan stood at the window of her temporary office, watching the helicopters approach. Her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts, a skill honed through years of covert operations, where the slightest facial tell could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The only outward sign of the previous day's assault was a faint discoloration on her cheek, already fading, but still visible in the morning light. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Ghost protocol, activation confirmed. Full briefing, 0730 Secure Room Alpha. She acknowledged with a single tap, then returned her attention to the approaching helicopters. Phase 2 was now officially in motion. At the airfield, Admiral Jackson stood at rigid attention as the helicopters touched down. From the lead aircraft emerged Admiral William Carter, Chief of Naval Operations, followed by General James Mitchell, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and finally General Robert Thompson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their combined presence represented an unprecedented concentration of military authority, sending a clear message about the seriousness with which the Pentagon viewed the situation. Admiral Jackson, Carter greeted his colleague with a formal handshake. The Secretary of Defense sends his regards and expects a full briefing by 0900. Jackson nodded. The investigation team is prepared, sir. Lieutenant General Harrison has compiled comprehensive findings that I believe warrant service-wide attention. General Mitchell's weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the base. And the incident officer, Captain Fletcher, is currently en route to the detention facility at Quantico, Jackson replied. Federal charges have been filed in addition to the military proceedings. General Thompson, whose storied career included combat leadership in both Gulf Wars, spoke next. And your daughter, Thomas, how is she handling this situation? For the first time, a hint of personal emotion crossed Jackson's face. With the professionalism and composure you'd expect, Robert. She's continuing her assessment mission despite the incident. Thompson nodded approvingly. I've reviewed portions of her service record. Impressive doesn't begin to cover it. The senior officers moved toward the waiting vehicles, their conversation shifting to the broader implications of what had been discovered at Naval Station Westbrook. Meanwhile, across the base, Colonel William Patterson sat alone in his office, contemplating the ruins of his military career. The investigation's preliminary findings had made it clear that he would face charges for his failure to address Captain Fletcher's pattern of misconduct. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Enter Tayu, he called, straightening his posture by reflex. Lieutenant General Harrison stepped into the office, his expression grave. Colonel Patterson, I've been instructed to inform you that, effective immediately, you are relieved of command of Naval Station Westbrook due to loss of confidence in your ability to lead. The words, though expected, still landed with devastating force. Patterson stood, his face pale but composed. I understand, sir. Who will be assuming command? Captain Angela Martinez is being promoted to colonel and will serve as interim commander pending permanent assignment, Harrison replied. The change of command ceremony will take place at 1300 hours today. Patterson nodded, accepting the inevitable. Will I be permitted to address the personnel? Harrison considered this request. You may make brief remarks, but they must be submitted for approval beforehand. And my legal status, sir? You'll remain on base under restricted movement orders while the JAG Corps prepares formal charges. Commander Williams will serve as your military counsel. Patterson looked around his office, taking in the photographs and commendations that chronicled his 27-year career. May I have time to gather my personal effects? You'll be escorted by military police, Harrison confirmed, 1 hour after the change of command ceremony. As Harrison departed, Patterson sank back into his chair, the full weight of accountability finally settling on his shoulders. His failure to address Fletcher's behavior hadn't just enabled yesterday's assault. It had created an environment where misconduct could flourish unchecked, undermining the very foundation of military discipline he had sworn to uphold. At precisely 0730 hours, Major Morgan entered Secure Briefing Room Alpha, where Admiral Jackson awaited, alongside Admiral Carter, and a silver-haired civilian introduced only as Director Wilson. The room had been swept for surveillance devices, and armed security stood outside the double-locked door. Major Morgan, Admiral Carter began once the room was secured. I've been briefed on your original assessment mission at Westbrook, but I understand there were additional parameters that weren't included in the official documentation. Morgan nodded. Yes, sir. My primary mission was to evaluate security protocols and information handling, but I was also tasked with assessing command climate and response to potential misconduct. Director Wilson spoke next, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to operating in the shadows of national security. The Ghost Protocol was never intended to be merely a combat or intelligence program. From its inception, we designed it to create operators who could move through any environment undetected, gathering accurate assessments without the biases that come when people know they're being observed. He activated a secure display showing a map of naval installations across the United States. What happened here at Westbrook has accelerated the timeline for Phase 2 of our assessment protocol. Major Morgan's experience has provided valuable insights into how leadership responds when confronted with misconduct, particularly when it involves female personnel. Admiral Carter studied the map, noting the highlighted installations. And these represent your next assessment targets. Yes, sir, Morgan confirmed. Based on preliminary data analysis, these 7 installations show potential indicators of similar command climate issues. Admiral Jackson entered the conversation. The Secretary of Defense has authorized an expanded mandate for the assessment team. You'll be leading a group of specially trained evaluators, all operating under Ghost Protocol parameters. Understood, sir, Morgan acknowledged. When do we deploy? The first team leaves tomorrow at 600, Jackson replied. But before that, there's the matter of Captain Fletcher. Wilson activated another display showing an encrypted file with Fletcher's military record. There's something you should know about Fletcher that wasn't in your initial briefing. This caught Morgan's attention immediately. He was actually an early candidate for the Ghost Protocol program in 2010. What? Morgan's surprise was genuine. I didn't see that in his file. It was compartmentalized, Wilson explained. He showed initial promise, but was removed from consideration during psychological evaluation. The assessment indicated unresolved trauma from his experience in Kandahar and concerning patterns in his attitudes toward female personnel in combat roles. And this information wasn't flagged in his regular service record. Admiral Carter asked, his tone indicating he already knew the answer. It was supposed to be, Wilson replied grimly, but the recommendation was overruled by his then commanding officer, who cited his exceptional combat performance. This is precisely the systemic issue we're addressing now. Twist 6. Morgan processed this revelation with professional detachment, though internally the irony wasn't lost on her. So the man who assaulted me was once considered for the same program I helped develop. There's more, Wilson continued. Federal prosecutors want your formal deposition this afternoon. Additionally, Fletcher has requested a meeting before formal charges are filed. Morgan raised an eyebrow. What's the nature of the request? Apparently, he wishes to apologize directly, Wilson explained. His counsel believes a face-to-face acknowledgement might influence sentencing recommendations. Morgan considered this. I'll meet with him, not for his benefit, but because it may provide additional insights for our broader assessment. As the secure briefing concluded, preparation for the change of command ceremony was underway across the base. Personnel in dress uniforms assembled on the parade ground, the atmosphere tense with anticipation and uncertainty. News of Colonel Patterson's relief had spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the command structure. At the detention facility, Captain Marcus Fletcher sat across from Commander Davidson, his military counsel reviewing the mounting charges against him. The federal prosecutor has added a charge of deprivation of rights under color of authority, Davidson explained. That's in addition to the assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming in violation of general regulations. Fletcher stared at the table, his earlier defiance replaced by grim acceptance. What's the maximum sentence? Davidson didn't sugarcoat it. 8 years in federal prison, dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits, and permanent prohibition from federal employment. Fletcher rubbed his face with his hands. All because I couldn't control my temper. No, Davidson corrected firmly. All because you physically assaulted another person in uniform without any legitimate authority to do so. The fact that she turned out to be a major conducting an official Pentagon assessment just magnifies the consequences. Fletcher looked up. Is it true what they're saying, that she's some kind of special operative? Davidson nodded. Major Morgan's full service record is classified, but what I've been cleared to know is that she's one of the most decorated intelligence officers in naval history. She's conducted operations in places most Americans don't know. We operate against threats most civilians never hear about. This information seemed to deflate Fletcher further. I've requested to speak with her before the formal charges are filed. Do you think she'll agree? She has, Davidson confirmed. She'll be here at 1400 hours. I should warn you, Captain, this isn't an opportunity to justify your actions or argue your case. If you have any hope of leniency, you need to demonstrate genuine remorse and complete acceptance of responsibility. Fletcher nodded slowly. I understand. At 1300 hours sharp, the change of command ceremony began on the main parade ground. The assembled personnel stood at attention as Colonel Patterson formally relinquished command to Colonel Angela Martinez. The ceremony, normally a celebration of leadership transition, had the somber air of a public reckoning. Patterson's remarks were brief and subdued. I accept full responsibility for the command failures identified during the investigation. Every leader must be accountable not only for their own actions, but for the culture they create through their decisions and priorities. I failed to uphold that sacred trust. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, her bearing projecting confidence and determination. At 45, she brought 22 years of distinguished service, including combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, along with a reputation for strict adherence to proper military protocol and discipline. Effective immediately, Martinez began addressing the assembled personnel. Naval Station Westbrook will implement comprehensive reforms to our reporting procedures, command accountability measures, and leadership training programs. Every member of this installation, regardless of rank, gender, or service record, deserves to serve in an environment where proper military discipline is maintained without fear or favoritism. Her voice carried across the parade ground with unmistakable authority. Any physical contact between personnel that isn't explicitly authorized by training protocols will be reported immediately. Any failure to report such incidents will result in charges of dereliction of duty. There will be zero tolerance for misconduct, regardless of an individual's combat record or decorations. As the ceremony concluded, Admiral Jackson approached Colonel Martinez. You have full authority to implement whatever reforms you deem necessary, Colonel. The eyes of the entire naval service are on Westbrook now. Martinez nodded. I understand, sir. By the time this is finished, we'll have established the model for command climate reform throughout the service. At 1400 hours, Major Morgan arrived at the detention facility where Captain Fletcher awaited her visit. She entered the interview room alone, having declined the offer of an escort or witness. Fletcher stood at attention as she entered, the contrast between them striking. Morgan in her full-dress uniform, with her impressive array of decorations and ribbons, Fletcher in standard utilities without insignia, the embodiment of a fallen officer. At ease, Captain, Morgan said, taking a seat across the table. I understand you requested this meeting. Fletcher sat down, his hands resting on the table. Up close, he could see details he had missed during their brief confrontation in the mess hall. The thin scar on her cheekbone that suggested past combat experiences. The subtle confidence in her posture that came from decades of high-stakes operations. Most notably, the complete absence of fear or intimidation in her gaze. Major Morgan, Fletcher began, his voice strained with emotion. I want to apologize for my inexcusable behavior in the mess hall. There is no justification for my actions, and I accept full responsibility for the assault and its consequences. Morgan studied him with the analytical precision that had made her so effective in intelligence work, assessing whether his remorse was genuine or merely tactical. Captain Fletcher, I appreciate your apology, but this isn't about me, she replied. I've experienced far worse in operational environments. What concerns me is what your behavior reveals about larger command culture issues. Fletcher nodded. I understand that now. My actions didn't happen in a vacuum. They were enabled by a command environment that prioritized combat experience over proper conduct and accountability. Tell me about Kandahar, Morgan said unexpectedly. The incident with Lieutenant Winters. Fletcher looked up sharply, surprised she knew about that pivotal moment in his service history. How did you? I reviewed your complete file, including psychological evaluations and after-action reports, Morgan explained. That incident appears to have significantly shaped your attitudes toward female personnel in combat-adjacent roles. Fletcher was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. We lost 2 men because of faulty intelligence. Lieutenant Winters insisted the route was clear based on her analysis. I argued for an alternate approach, but her assessment prevailed. 20 minutes later, My Humvee hit an IED. And you blamed her gender rather than examining the systemic intelligence failures that led to that assessment, Morgan observed. Yes, Fletcher admitted. It was easier to blame her than to accept that combat is inherently unpredictable, that intelligence is always imperfect, regardless of who provides it. Morgan leaned forward slightly. Captain, I've commanded operations where men died because of decisions I made. Every combat leader carries that burden. The difference is whether we learn from those experiences or allow them to distort our judgment about entire categories of personnel. Fletcher absorbed this recognition dawning in his eyes. I never made that connection before. Twist 7, I know you were once considered for the Ghost Protocol program, Morgan said, watching his reaction carefully. Fletcher's head snapped up, genuine shock on his face. How did you, that was classified. I was told those records were sealed. They were, but nothing is truly sealed from those who designed the program, Morgan replied. You showed promise, Fletcher, but the psychological evaluations revealed unresolved trauma and concerning behavioral patterns. Fletcher's shoulders slumped further. They said I wasn't stable enough, that my experiences had left me with blind spots that could compromise operations. They were right, Morgan said, not unkindly. Your assault on me was the culmination of a pattern that began in Kandahar. You developed a bias against female personnel in positions of authority, and rather than addressing that bias through proper channels, you allowed it to fester until it manifested as physical aggression. What happens now? Fletcher asked, his voice hollow. That's not for me to decide, Morgan replied. The legal process will take its course. But I will say this: true accountability begins with honest self-examination. If you're genuinely committed to taking responsibility, start by examining the beliefs and assumptions that led you to this point. As Morgan stood to leave, Fletcher spoke again. Major, may I ask one question? She paused. You may. The Ghost Protocol, was it worth it? All that training, all that sacrifice? Morgan regarded him for a long moment. Captain Fletcher, there are aspects of naval operations that remain classified even after careers end. What I can tell you is that appearances can be deceiving, and assumptions about capability based on gender or physical stature are not just morally wrong, but operationally dangerous. With that, she departed, leaving Fletcher to contemplate the fuller dimensions of his failure of judgment. Outside the detention facility, Morgan found Admiral Jackson waiting. How did it go? He asked. About as expected, Morgan replied. He's beginning to understand the broader implications of his actions, but true accountability will take time. She paused. I mentioned his previous consideration for Ghost Protocol. He seemed genuinely surprised I knew about it. Jackson nodded. The Secretary of Defense has approved the expansion of Ghost Protocol assessments to all 7 identified installations. You'll be leading the oversight team with direct reporting authority to the Joint Chiefs. And Colonel Martinez. She'll implement the reformed command structure here at Westbrook, establishing the model for similar changes across the service, Jackson confirmed. Her promotion to full colonel will be formalized next week. They walked together toward the administration building where final preparations were underway for the expanded investigation. There's something else, Jackson added. General Thompson has requested that you brief the Joint Chiefs on your assessment methodology. He believes your approach could have applications beyond the naval service. Morgan considered this. The Ghost Protocol was designed to be adaptable to multiple operational environments. With proper modifications, it could certainly be applied to other branches. As evening approached, an unprecedented meeting convened in the secure conference room. Admiral Carter, General Mitchell, and General Thompson sat alongside Admiral Jackson and Major Morgan, reviewing the comprehensive assessment plan that would reshape command accountability throughout the military. This goes beyond addressing a single incident, General Thompson observed. What we're proposing is a fundamental recalibration of how we evaluate command effectiveness in leadership culture. Admiral Carter nodded. For too long, we've allowed combat decorations to overshadow proper conduct and accountability. Major Morgan's experience has provided a wake-up call that we can't ignore. General Mitchell, whose Marine Corps experience gave him unique perspective on combat leadership, studied the assessment protocols with professional appreciation. The beauty of this approach is that it evaluates commanders in their natural environment without the distortions that come when people know they're being watched. Morgan addressed the practical implementation. We'll deploy 7 assessment teams, each led by a Ghost Protocol graduate, to the identified installations. They'll operate under cover identities, gathering unfiltered data on command climate reporting procedures and accountability mechanisms. In the timeline, General Thompson asked. 90 days for the initial assessment phase, Morgan replied, with preliminary findings available within 30 days for installations showing critical deficiencies. As the meeting concluded, the senior officers stood to depart. Admiral Jackson remained behind briefly with his daughter. Kate, he said quietly, using her familiar name now that they were alone. What happened here could have ended very differently. Morgan nodded, understanding his meaning. Every field operative accepts certain risks, Dad. This one had an unexpectedly positive outcome for the service as a whole. Jackson studied his daughter pride mixing with the concern that had defined their relationship throughout her military career. You know, I've never told you this, but watching you forge your path in a male-dominated field, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life. Morgan allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. You supported me without ever pulling strings. That's all I ever wanted. Not entirely true, Jackson admitted with a small smile of his own. I may have quietly ensured you faced tougher standards than anyone else. Not to hold you back, but because I knew you could exceed them. I suspected as much, Morgan replied, surprising him. And I appreciated it, Dad. It meant I never had to question whether I earned my place. Climax 4. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was filled with military personnel as Captain Marcus Fletcher received his sentence. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom and across the military community. Captain Fletcher, you have been found guilty on all federal charges, including assault on a federal officer and deprivation of rights under color of authority. The evidence presented during this trial demonstrates a pattern of aggressive behavior that culminated in an unprovoked attack on a senior officer conducting official duties. The sentence was severe but expected 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Fletcher would also face a military court-martial upon completion of his federal sentence, ensuring that his dismissal from service would be permanent and with loss of all benefits. Major Morgan sat in the gallery, her presence serving as a reminder of the institutional authority that had been challenged. Her testimony during the trial had been devastating in its professional precision, describing not just the assault but the broader implications for military discipline and command respect. Colonel Patterson received a lighter sentence of 2 years in federal prison for criminal negligence and failure to maintain proper command oversight. His military pension was forfeited and he was barred from federal employment for life. The systemic changes initiated by the Westbrook incident spread rapidly throughout the naval service. What began as a disciplinary matter at a single installation had grown into a comprehensive reformation of military leadership culture across all branches. At Naval Station Westbrook, the transformation was complete and permanent. Colonel Martinez had implemented reforms that became the standard across all naval installations. Anonymous reporting systems had identified and addressed dozens of potential misconduct cases before they could escalate to criminal behavior. Sergeant Rodriguez, now promoted to Master Sergeant, served as the base's senior enlisted advisor for command climate issues. His willingness to report the initial incident had earned him recognition and advancement, demonstrating that protecting institutional integrity was rewarded rather than punished. The reforms quickly spread beyond Westbrook. At Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia, a similar assessment discovered patterns of ignored misconduct. At Fort Bragg, Army leadership implemented the new accountability standards, replacing 3 senior officers after an unannounced Ghost Protocol evaluation. Within a year, 12 military installations had undergone complete command climate overhauls based on the Westbrook model. Major Morgan was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as director of the expanded Ghost Protocol Assessment Program. Her handling of the Westbrook incident and the subsequent service-wide assessment had demonstrated leadership qualities that accelerated her career trajectory toward the highest levels of military command. The Joint Chiefs formally adopted the Ghost Protocol Assessment methodology for evaluating leadership effectiveness across all branches. For the first time, the military had a standardized, unbiased means of assessing command climate without the distortions created by pre-announced inspections. The mess hall where the assault occurred had been renovated and now displayed a plaque commemorating the importance of military discipline and respect for authority. Personnel eating there were reminded daily that aggressive behavior had no place in professional military service. It was formally renamed Morgan Hall in recognition of the lasting impact of that single confrontation. 5 years later, as Fletcher completed his federal sentence and prepared for military court-martial, an unexpected development occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, now overseeing the training of a new generation of assessment specialists, requested permission to interview Fletcher for the program's case study curriculum. Their meeting took place in a secure room at the Military Justice Facility 5 years to the day after their confrontation in the Westbrook Mess Hall. Fletcher had aged visibly, the stress of imprisonment etched into his face, but his bearing remained military straight as Morgan entered. "Colonel Morgan," he acknowledged, noting her promotion. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Morgan took a seat across from him. "Mr. Fletcher, I've been following your progress through the rehabilitation program. Your counselors report significant changes in your perspectives on leadership and accountability." Fletcher nodded. "Prison provides ample time for reflection. I've spent 5 years examining the beliefs and assumptions that led to my actions that day." "And what have you concluded?" Morgan asked. "That true leadership isn't demonstrated through intimidation or authority, but through accountability and respect," Fletcher replied. "That my failure wasn't just in striking you, but in creating an environment where such behavior seemed justified." Morgan studied him carefully, assessing his sincerity. "Would you be willing to share those insights with our assessment specialist? Your experience provides valuable perspective on how command failures develop and how they might be prevented." Fletcher looked surprised. "You want me to contribute to the program?" "After what I did. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those who've experienced the consequences of failure firsthand," Morgan explained. "Your perspective could help identify similar patterns before they escalate to misconduct." As Fletcher considered this unexpected opportunity, Morgan continued, "The military is ultimately about learning and adaptation. Even our failures can serve a purpose if we're willing to examine them honestly and use them to improve the institution we've sworn to serve." Fletcher's case study eventually became required reading at all service academies. The Westbrook incident became a cornerstone of leadership training throughout the military, used to illustrate how unchecked bias-traumatic experiences and command environment failures could combine with catastrophic results. The reforms initiated by the incident transformed the military's approach to personnel evaluation and accountability. Special attention was paid to combat decorated officers, ensuring that battlefield heroics didn't shield them from accountability for misconduct. New training programs addressed unconscious bias and trauma response, helping leaders recognize and address their own psychological blind spots before they could affect their judgment. The GHOST protocol itself expanded beyond its original conception, becoming a comprehensive approach to organizational assessment applicable to any hierarchical structure. Its core principles of unannounced observation, multiple evaluation perspectives, and bias-free analysis were adapted for use throughout government agencies and even select corporate environments. 10 years after the incident, Admiral Jackson's retirement ceremony drew military leadership from around the world. His 4-decade career had culminated in transformative leadership of Naval Special Warfare Command, with the GHOST protocol representing his most lasting legacy. In his final address, Jackson summarized what had begun as an assault, but evolved into a transformation. "The strength of our military isn't measured by weapons systems or technology, but by our commitment to the values we defend. When we hold ourselves accountable to those values, especially in times of challenge, we demonstrate the true meaning of service and sacrifice." Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, now a full colonel herself and rumored to be in line for general officer consideration, watched from the audience as her father concluded his distinguished career. The burden of being an admiral's daughter had shaped her entire life, driving her to excel beyond any standard that might be expected of her. In the decades since the Westbrook incident, she had helped transform the military's approach to leadership evaluation and accountability. The GHOST protocol assessments had identified and addressed command climate issues at dozens of installations, preventing countless potential incidents before they could occur. The impact extended far beyond the naval service. The Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps had all adopted variations of the assessment methodology. The Defense Department now maintained permanent assessment teams that could deploy unannounced to any installation worldwide, ensuring that standards of discipline and accountability were maintained consistently. As Morgan reflected on the unexpected path that had led from that morning in the mess hall to a fundamental reshaping of military culture, she recognized that sometimes the most important missions weren't the ones conducted in the shadows. Sometimes the most meaningful change came from standing in the light, allowing others to see clearly what had previously been obscured. What had begun as a simple assault had triggered a cascade of reforms that would benefit generations of service members. The transformation of Naval Station Westbrook from a base that tolerated aggressive behavior to a model of proper military discipline demonstrated that institutional change was possible when leadership was held accountable for creating and maintaining appropriate command climates. In military academies across the nation, cadets and midshipmen now study the case as a fundamental lesson in leadership ethics. The message was clear as true. Military strength comes not from intimidation, but from integrity, accountability, and respect. Colonel Morgan's legacy would extend far beyond her classified operations. Her most enduring contribution would be the cultural transformation she had helped initiate, a military where everyone, regardless of gender, rank, or combat record, was held to the same standard of conduct and accountability. The plaque in Morgan Hall at Naval Station Westbrook bore a simple inscription that captured this philosophy. True strength comes not from power exercised, but from power restrained by principle.